A critical mistake was made by creating US security zones around US headquarters in central Baghdad. This has created a no-go zone for Iraqis and has allowed the attackers to push the US into a fortress that tends to separate US personnel from the Iraqis. Anthony H. Cordsman, Middle East military expert.
Welcome back to Inside Iraq. We are discussing the green zone, whether it's time to abandon it and whether the Iraqi government in the future can live without it. Bob, Joshua was saying that the Iraqi government installed, it came through the ballot boxes. It is not the creation of the Americans. It is time to go beyond what happened. Your response?
Well, I mean, I think the elections in Iraq so far have been a joke. They've been dominated by mafia-like militias run by the Supreme Council and by other parties. The whole country is awash with armed organizations of all sorts and all descriptions, from the Sunni Awakening to the Mahdi Army to the Badr organization and many, many others that are local. The elections have been marked by intimidation. I spoke just the other day to Iyad Alawi, whose list said, he told me that 13 of his candidates in the last election were assassinated by death squads that were either associated with the religious parties or with Iran or both. There's a huge amount of intimidation. The Sunnis boycotted the election. This is a chaotic mess.
So you don't expect anything to be different when the provincial elections, or perhaps even more importantly, the federal elections in October of 2009 is going to, the outcome is going to change the political landscape in Iraq, or is it going to be more of the same?
No, I think it's extremely dangerous, because the three main elections that were the three cities that are important, Mosul, Baghdad, and Diyala province, where these elections are most important. In Mosul, I think you're going to have the Kurds intimidating Sunnis, keeping them away from the ballots, basically stealing the election. In Baghdad, I think the same will happen with the Shiite parties and their militias, intimidating and even assassinating people that they don't want to vote. And in Diyala, you've already had Prime Minister Maliki
some people would listen to you and they say this is a conjecture. Go ahead, Joshua.
Justin, this is so ridiculous. Dreyfus lives in his own little world where facts on the ground and things that are reported by international observers and so have no meaning. Only what he and his little coterie of far left friends say to each other becomes the reality.
Why is that?
Listen to the. Let me tell you. Listen to the absurd self-contradiction. First, he sad
let's not do personal
Iraqi
attacks,
officials.
though, okay?
Let me finish. Let me finish. First, he said that the Iraqi officials, the elected officials, were installed by the U.S. government. And then when I said this is a lie, which it is, he answered, I just spoke to Iyad Alawi, who said that 13 of his candidates were assassinated. Well, Iyad Alawi is the one Iraqi figure who was installed in an earlier government by the Americans and who was for years the favorite of the CIA to take over Iraq. And so is Dreyfus saying that 13 of Alawi's candidates were assassinated by the U.S.?
No, that is not the case, Joshua Moravchik. What it is,
it's all helpless.
Let me explain.
Ridiculous
Iyad Alawi was an interim.
You're a genius.
Iyad Alawi was an interim prime minister for a certain period of time. The 13 members of his Iraqi national list that were assassinated were referring to the 2005 elections.
Yes, but were they assassinated by the Americans?
No, he's not saying that. He's saying assassinated by religious-based militias.
No. Yes, but he said just
look.
But
the
what he said
thing is
twice
we invaded
at
Iraq.
the beginning of the show. That what he said twice at the beginning of the show was that the Iraqi government was installed by the Americans, the current elected Iraqi government, and I said that was a lie. And he, trying to prove his point,
to Bob.
said,
Go ahead, Bob.
13 people.
Go ahead, Bob.
One thing doesn't prove the other.
Okay,
it's the opposite of the other.
Go ahead, Bob.
Look, we went into Iraq with no plan to create an alternate government. We ended up creating the Iraqi Governing Council, and we put on that Governing Council a collection, almost like it was taken from some zoo, of strange and wonderful people that we selected based on our own decision-making, people like Abdulaziz Hakim,
insult
people
Iraqis
like
why do you insult Iraqis like that? Don't you think
Iraqi
Arabs
governing
are people
council,
too? Why do you say they came from a zoo? Why do you say a zoo? Don't you think Arabs are as much human beings as you and I?
Yeah, I certainly have hundreds of Arab friends who I love and respect. My point is that I don't have a lot of respect for Abdulaziz Hakim. I think the mistakes that we made in putting together an appointed Iraqi governing council, in allowing them to establish a foothold that gave them a lock over the next elections, was an absurd mistake.
Bob Dreyfus, before I let Joshua answer you, let me add this too. Joshua, many Iraqi politicians, as well as certain parties, they lodge complaint with the higher committee for the freedom of elections. And pretty much almost you could say the Supreme Court of Iraq issued a decree that the 2005 election was fraudulent. This was published in the Iraqi official newspaper.
Well, I don't know what decree you're talking about, Jassim, and I don't know what you mean by fraudulent. This was
meaning to say boxes filled with thousands of ballots. They came from Iran.
No, that doesn't mean
and this
that
is
the
according to the Iraqi government itself, that the Iraqi police confiscated the trucks filled with boxes filled with ballots.
Jassim, you're twisting this around, because
I'm just reporting the facts.
You can have. No, you're not reporting the facts. You're putting a spin on them. Because in elections all over the world, you have irregularities. We have that right now in the U.S. in the state of Minnesota with a big fight over the Senate seat. We had it in 2000 in Florida in the U.S. And if you go to less developed countries, which have not had long traditions of free elections, and if you go to countries in which there's warfare and terrorism going on, you will have irregularities. And the question
so, Bob, you just have to live with it. This has happened. You have to grow up.
Let me finish.
Just, we have to live up with it.
Let me finish.
Go ahead.
Let me finish.
Go ahead.
Let me finish. Let me finish. You have, the question is how severe and how widespread the irregularities are. Now, a fraudulent election is what they have in Syria, where 99.9% of the people vote for Bashar al-Assad.
You made your point, Joshua. Let's listen to Bob.
But when you have certain irregularities, that doesn't add up to a fraudulent election.
I have less than 1 minute, Bob. Go ahead. Make your point.
I will grant that Joshua is right, that their elections in Iraq are freer and fairer than the ones in Syria or the ones in Saudi Arabia or in Egypt. That said, the elections in Iraq have been a joke. And the idea that this government of militias and religious parties is somehow a democratic government is just wrong. This is a government in which Prime Minister Maliki is trying to aggregate power to himself, creating his own militias in these provincial councils, building ties to the army, arresting just last week dozens of people in the Interior Ministry and elsewhere on no charges or trumped-up charges, and then being forced to release them 24 hours later. This Iraqi government is anti-democratic, and the coming provincial elections are going to be marked by violence and intimidation and fraud. So we're leaving behind a mess in Iraq, and I'm afraid that it's going to be getting worse and worse and probably more violent as
more
the
relevant
American
to our
troops
issue,
begin
Bob
to draw
Dreyfus.
down.
The question is whether the Iraqi government can live without the green zone. Robert Dreyfus, Joshua Moravchik, gentlemen, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq. To access the show and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Until then, goodbye.